I'm going to talk a little bit about China's buildup, and I'm actually going to wander into the START issue as well. Seems to be on everybody's mind these days, and rightfully so. I doubt anybody here doesn't believe that China is involved in an unprecedented military buildup. This has been going on for quite some time, from when I was serving on the Hill in the late 1990s to actually at the Pentagon, Frank, as opposed to State Department. That's okay. But it's going on across the board. The People's Liberation Army, which is the collective name for China's military, is modernizing, building up, improving every sector of its military capabilities. The People's Liberation Army itself, the People's Liberation Air Force, the People's Liberation Army's Navy, and of course the 2nd Artillery, which is their nuclear forces, also under the PLA. In fact, you can read about this in the Pentagon's report, going back to when we were on the Hill. We had asked the Pentagon to write an annual report to Congress on China's military capabilities, and they've been doing that. And once again this year, they've given a fair treatment to it. Obviously, you're not going to get everything. This report has to pass through the interagency process, which means everybody even though it's written by DIA and vetted in the Pentagon, the NSC gets a chop at it, State Department and others. So it's not telling you everything, and there's reasons things are said and not said in that report, but it's a pretty good primer, as it has been over the years, about China's strategy and about their capabilities. Like I said, it's very careful in its wording. You have to read between the lines sometimes, but it's definitely worth a read if you're interested in this topic. And this issue, I think considering what we're dealing with with China today, there's so many issues out there, whether you're talking about currency valuation, whether you're talking about the trade imbalance, especially the economic issues out there. It's indigenous innovation, the forced technology transfers, our companies getting a fair shake in the Chinese economy. The military issue, I think, has really been flying below the radar. I went to the Pentagon in 2001 off of Capitol Hill, and I had the Asia-Pacific portfolio, and I thought that was going to be what the Pentagon was all about. We had the EP3 incident, and it was going to be dealing with the rise of China, and then 9/11 came along. And China and a lot of other issues were, and rightfully so, but China, they were put down at a lesser priority than some of the other current threats that we were facing at the time. But so this issue, especially their military buildup, I think has been flying below the radar of a lot of people that are involved in security quite broadly, and I think that's a mistake. And I think it's more important, especially since it's unclear exactly what China's intentions are. I certainly have my views, and I think China has great ambitions. I'm very concerned about its military buildup, but not everybody is. And it's very difficult, if you look at this even academically, to really determine exactly China's strategic ambitions. I think that China has great ambitions. I think it definitely wants to replace the United States at the head of state powers. But the Chinese are very coy about this. And if you look at a lot of their writings on this issue, they will talk about being very careful about letting others know exactly what their ambitions are. Not to let people think that there is a China threat out there. But I think there's very good reason to be concerned about China's rise, especially from a military perspective. We're especially seeing this at a particular emphasis on China's power projection forces, which means that China is going to be able to project its influence using military instruments well beyond its coastline and its periphery. There's a lot of emphasis on their Navy. There's a lot of emphasis on their Air Force. There's a lot of emphasis on their ballistic missiles. In fact, most people don't realize this, but China now has the second largest Navy in Asia, if you include the United States. Absent the United States, China now has the largest Navy in the Pacific. They have new destroyers with advanced missiles. An aircraft carrier, which many people said would never happen, is actually happening. And in fact, it's probably around the corner for us in the next couple of years. China will send its first aircraft carrier to sea. I remember when watching this for a while, people said that would never happen. China, air operations aboard an aircraft carrier were just too hard. But China, and in fact, occasionally you heard that actually from our own military, our own Navy, who were dealing with the Chinese. But the fact is that the Chinese looks like they're going to have some sort of aircraft carrier in the future. We will not be the only country with an aircraft carrier in the Pacific in the years to come. They're also building attack submarines, nuclear attack submarines, and they're building fleet ballistic missile submarines. And they're building, they already have a new class, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but they already have, so they're building both new attack as well as fleet ballistic missile submarines. The Army which has been huge, is actually downsizing, but the fact is they're professionalizing as they downsize. They're doing things that we've done for years and the Brits have done, such as having a professional non-commissioned officers corps, which, as we all know, anybody who served in the military knows is really the core and the strength and the steel of our military is our non-commissioned officers. So they're moving in that direction. They're also talking about joint operations. The ground forces are talking about joint operations, which include the air and as well as ground forces, and even in some cases naval forces. The People's Liberation Air Force, People's Liberation Army Air Force, is actually has developed long-range advanced strategic air missiles, or SAMs. They have fourth-generation aircraft now, which is not quite on par with what we're talking about, but not really far behind us. We're not talking about them having the capability of the Joint Strike Fighter, but they're not too far behind some of our older systems that are still very capable. The other thing that they're talking about, and they're doing, I shouldn't say just talking about, actually not talking about much, that's the challenge here, is they're not always talking about much, so we have to be very careful in watching them, but they're developing counter space and cyber capabilities. This is part of China's asymmetric military strategy. The Chinese believe that they can be using asymmetric capabilities, in other words, taking what they perceive to be their strength versus our weakness, that they can get into a David versus Goliath situation where David, being China, could take out Goliath, being the United States. This is part of their strategy. They've had an anti-satellite test. They're still continuing to develop counter space forces. And one of the things I'm really worried about is cyber capabilities. You talk about EMP, cyber's along the way. There is a possibility, if systems can be accessed, that the Chinese are an enemy of the United States. There are over 100 countries that are working on cyber capabilities today for warfare purposes, that they could actually win a war without firing a shot. Probably not quite as devastating as EMP, but the fact is that if you were able to do, shut down military systems, shut off satellites, things like that, it would put you at a tremendous disadvantage. Now, if you've been following the cyber issue at all, you know that they've penetrated the Pentagon's computer systems. They've penetrated defense industry. There have been terabytes of information that have been swifted away via the internet, and China is believed to be behind that. And also something that's really scary to me in the same light of the EMP threat is that China and Russia have been reportedly have mapped our electrical grid systems using cyber. The idea of mapping them was that, in other words, to shut them down if a war would come about. Just think about it, if we went to war with a country and they were able to not only do something militarily, but shut off the power, shut off the lights, shut off the air traffic control system, and all of these other sort of things. It would be a tremendous distraction to the National Command Authority. Shut off power to hospitals, shut off, it would cause a tremendous amount of chaos in a time when an enemy might be able to make a tremendous amount of progress on the battlefield. So it's something to be worried about. And then there's other things. There's one thing I'm really worried about, and it kind of fits. It's interesting that Peter and I guess Ben should be congratulated on putting us here to talk about it, because there's going to be a lot of cross currents here, and we're speaking generally about different things in a way. But there's, one of the things I'm really worried about, and I don't think is even getting less attention within the debate or consideration of China's military buildup, is their strategic forces. It's not always as sexy as perhaps a new fighter aircraft or a new some sort of new missile like a cruise missile from a ship or something along that line. And there is a tremendous amount of concern. I don't know if you're aware of it, but China is developing a ballistic missile that will have a maneuverable warhead, a MARV, not a MERV, that is believed to be targeted against American aircraft carriers. This is revolutionary. And unfortunately, without taking out the shooter, the United States Navy has no way to defend against it. So that's something, very considered. Like I said, read that report. I could speak all day about China's military, but you can kind of get into it. On the limited time I have, I would say take a look at that report. There's a lot of things in there that you can certainly learn if you're interested in this subject. But I'm worried about China's strategic buildup, and especially in consideration of our consideration of START. I mean, how many, when we had the debate going on in the Senate and obviously on the Hill and other places, we talked about verification procedures. We talked about our 20 to 30% decrease in our strategic forces. We talked about its restraints on missile defense. It just went on and on and on. All very good issues. But the fact of the matter is that it didn't seem to me that China it was ever even considered to any great extent, from what I can see. Obviously, the Senate had their deliberations that I wasn't necessarily privileged to, but I think that there was things that China was not the buildup of Chinese forces, because the fact of the matter is as we're building down, China's building up. And there's reasons to be worried about this. The Pentagon, in this report, for instance, will say that China has the most active land-based ballistic and cruise missile program in the world today. That's a quote. They got new missiles. They have new missile units. They have upgrades to existing systems. They're working on counters to ballistic missile defense, including penetration aids. Basically, as China builds up, we're building down by some 20 to 30% under start. I mean, in talk about modernization, I mean, I'm sure the congressman I know he has been involved in this issue, but today I think most of the B-52s we fly are older than the pilots that fly them. Yeah, what is they're 32 years of age or something like that. I mean, our B-52s are more than that. I mean, this is an issue here. China's modernizing across the board while we're not. Originally China had very much a fixed, a limited number of fixed silo ICBMs that were, basically armed with large 3 to 5 megaton sort of weapons. Today, China is moving from those fixed silos to road mobile missiles that are solid fueled. This has been reported. I can't confirm this, and I didn't see it in the Pentagon report, but I've seen it reported a couple of places. But it says the Second Artillery, once again, China's nuclear forces, have built 3,000 miles of underground tunnels. 3,000 miles of underground tunnels, and if you think of it from a strategic standpoint, that's obviously to play the sort of classic shell game as to where they're putting their road mobile missiles. Also, it would keep us from knowing how many road mobile missiles they had once they were produced, and putting 3,000 miles, think about that, 3,000 miles of underground tunnels. In fact, it's supposedly called the Great Underground Wall, or the Underground Great Wall. And this was built by China's artillery in the northern part of the country. The Pentagon will say that they've moved to MIRVs, which means that not only they won't have just one warhead on a nuclear missile, but they may have many warheads on a nuclear missile. We don't really have a good sense of how many warheads they have. A lot of people are saying we're talking about 250. A lot of people say the number is 2 times that. Well, if you start adding MIRVs and if you start adding other new systems such as submarines, which I'll talk about in a moment, it can go pretty quickly. In my view, if there's any country out there that could rush to parity, they quote rush to parity or nuclear parity with the United States and Russia, it's China. They have the capability, they have the wealth, they're willing to lavish a tremendous amount of largesse on the People's Liberation Army, including the Second Artillery. And China, once again, is moving from a monad to a triad. The monad, the fixed silos, and now they're moving to a triad. They have new SSBNs, Fleet Ballistic Missile Submarines, the Jin class, type 094. Those 094 will carry 12 ICBMs. And they're expecting that China is going to have probably 5 of that class. They're already working on the next class of SSBN, which is going to be the 096 class. And it's going to carry, I think it's going to carry 24 ICBMs. And China that obviously makes, I mean, if any of you are old enough to go back to the Cold War and looking around the room, there aren't too many of you, but that was the thing that when I was in the Navy, the thing that we were most worried about when I was working against the Soviets. I flew EP-3s in the Navy and flew aboard those planes, and we were collecting on the Soviet Union, and one of the biggest concerns was the position and location of their SSBN fleet, because that was the really survivable deterrent. And today China is sending its nuclear deterrent, which had been land-based, to sea. So they're going to have a capable force there. I don't know how many of these newest class of 096 they're going to build, but I expect there's probably going to be at least 5 of them, or maybe more. They did have it, during the Cold War, they did have one class that was called the Shia. It was a nuclear submarine, a fleet ballistic missile submarine. It was so terrible it never even left territorial waters, from what I understand. It spent most of its time pierside. But they're moving from this land-based, not only road mobile, but also to a sea-based deterrent. They also have the B-6 bomber, which is basically a refitted Tu-16, a Tu-16 Badger of Soviet days. But they're developing land attack cruise missiles. Some people, maybe our good friend here could tell us about whether those are nuclear capable or not, but some people surmise that they will not only have conventional warheads, but they may also have nuclear warheads as well. They're air-launched cruise missiles for the B-6 bomber. Another thing that worries me is Chinese policy. That's what I'm saying. I talk about, and I'm sure that there are many of us have, firm ideas of where China's going, and I wanted to be kind of open and fair about it. But the same sort of, it's critically important when you're thinking about threat to not only look at capabilities, but look at intent. It can take you years to build capabilities. Intent can change overnight. And that's the really critical thing here. And China is very difficult to understand. They keep their cards very close to their chest. It's very difficult to understand exactly what they're thinking about things. But in terms of nuclear policy, first of all, generally based on two things: no first use, and then a minimum deterrence. But I'm hearing from people who do speak Chinese and follow this debate very closely, or follow this issue very closely, that there is an ongoing debate in China about their nuclear forces and nuclear force policy. These are by people who can read Chinese and can read the papers and can read the books that are being written. There's a big debate, especially among young strategists, a new generation of strategists who are coming into their most productive years after China became a republic, years when China started to become a nuclear power. Some of them even born maybe in the 1980s. So China, there's a question of whether China is actually involved has minimum deterrence, which is basically an ability to undertake a retaliatory strike, perhaps in China's case, against counter-value forces. In other words, going against population centers. That if you take a shot at us, we're going to have the capability to retaliate. Now the question is China moving from that minimum deterrence structure to a limited deterrence structure? In fact, the Pentagon, interestingly, calls China's nuclear strategy a limited deterrence strategy, which means that they retain the ability not only to conduct a second strike, but to not only go after counter-value or population centers, but also to go against an opponent's nuclear forces. That means you would have to have more delivery vehicles. It means you would also have to have more warheads. There's also talk that a lot of people say China has an active defense strategy, but this active defense strategy actually allows for preemption. In fact, a lot of China's active defense is very offensive if you look at some of the wars they've been involved in since 1969. But interestingly, to me, they've always called them defensive actions, even though they may have taken the offense. Like in 1979 in their short war against Vietnam, China was the aggressor but called it a defensive action against Vietnam. So there's questions about preemption today in China's nuclear forces. The problem is we just don't know. China is very secretive about its nuclear policy. In fact, we've been trying to have some sort of exchanges at the Pentagon, not me, but I mean the United States over time to talk about nuclear issues, and they've kind of kept us at arm's length. In fact, when we had one of their senior leaders, we invited the leader of the 2nd Artillery to Strategic Command, and they sent a different officer. They wouldn't send the leader of the 2nd Artillery, is my understanding, and they've really refused to engage on the nuclear issue. And as such, because of all this, I think that it's really pretty important that as we look at START, which is a treaty with Russia that will last at least 10 years, that we also look at the issue of China. I mean, this is a major rising power that I believe is a peer competitor of the United States and would like to replace the United States as the preeminent power in the Pacific and globally. That's my view on it. They're developing those capabilities, whether you're talking about politically, economically, and certainly militarily, and that's been going on for some time now. And unfortunately, if you look at PLA, it's interesting, if you look at PLA writings, the PLA, the military once again, sees the United States as the most likely enemy.